Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to week 2 of Sagalong. This week, we read chapters 23 through 44 of Egil's Saga, which I am reading in this bind-up of the Sagas of the Icelanders. Now, these 22 chapters are not quite a quarter of the saga. In fact, this chunk of the saga and last week's chunk of the saga together are only just over a third of the saga. So our reading of the saga this year is very back-ended with a lot. So this upcoming week and next week will have probably a lot jam-packed into them, which should be great fun. Which isn't to say that there isn't a lot of interesting stuff to talk about with this chunk. But I will say off the bat that last week's chunk of 22 chapters felt very much like its own self-contained dramatic narrative, right? We had a central character, Thorolf, who we followed for much of that chunk. We had a central villain of sorts in the form of Harold, King of Norway, and that chunk ended with Thorolf being killed by Harold in spectacular fashion. And so it felt very much like a self-contained narrative. It almost feels like you could take that chunk out of the saga and set it on its own and have it be its own like mini saga or saga within a saga, if you will. It's almost a bit like a really long cold open to a movie or something, right? But these 22 chapters are very different. They feel very much like a transitional period, very much like pieces are being moved across the board in preparation for something big to come. And that's not to say that there's not interesting stuff happening then. And one of the interesting things that happens in this part of the saga is that Skallagrim decides to flee Norway for Iceland. He flees with his family and some of his extended family and friends, and he flees Norway to escape from the rule of King Harald and settles in Iceland. And he and his group are among the first people to settle in Iceland. So what we see here is kind of the beginning of Iceland, right, as a nation, right? We see people naming locations in Iceland and giving them names based on, events that happened there or people. That was very cool. It felt to me very Tolkien-esque, right? Tolkien always loved saying, oh, this spot was named such and such after such and such a person or after such and such a battle that happened here or an incident that happened here or something. And it was cool to see them naming things and how they named things. I'd be really curious to go to Iceland at some point and see whether these places are still named, what they're being named in this saga. That would be cool. But so you also see Skallagrim and his friends and family sort of getting their lives set up in Iceland, right? They have to make a living there somehow, survive. And you see them kind of getting set up, getting settled in. And so that's why this chunk felt very much like a transitional period for me. Now, one really interesting thing that we get in this part of the saga is that we really start to get a look at Egil, the title character. We get to start to get a real look at who he is. And boy, he's a piece of work. He is something else. And I will demonstrate that with a couple of anecdotes. So the first one is when Egil is still quite young. I think he's under the age of 10 at this point in the saga still. And what happens is a lot of young men and boys in Iceland decide to get together for some games. So it makes reference to ball games being played, but the game that Egil is interested in at this event is wrestling. It says that he is big on wrestling, and he wrestles with a boy who is not much older, a bit older than him, but older enough to be quite a bit bigger, quite a bit stronger. And interestingly, that boy is named Grim. And Grim is also the original name of Egil's father, right? We call him Skallagrim, but he was born as Grim. Skallagrim, he was just given that name because he went bald before the age of 25. Skallagrim means bald grim. And so I'll tell you the rest of the anecdote, and you'll see why it's interesting that he's named Grim. So Grim beats Egil, fair and square, as far as I can tell, in the wrestling match, and Egil isn't very happy. So one of the older boys who's there with him gives him an axe, and he sticks that axe into the other boy's skull and kills him, as one does. And the reason that it's interesting that that other boy that he killed was named Grim, the same name as his father, is because it becomes very, very clear that Egil has some daddy issues. So, like, the very next scene, basically, is when Skallagrim basically attacks Egil, and then Skallagrim is reprimanded by a servant woman who fostered Egil, and tells him, oh, you know, you're attacking your own son, don't do that. And then Egil, what does he do? He chases her outside and chases her off the edge of a cliff, and she dies. So, like father, like son, right? But they clearly do not get along, as you might guess by the fact that Skallagrim was attacking Egil in the previous scene. But it's clear that this is a dysfunctional family on multiple levels, because Thorolf, not the Thorolf of the first chunk, but Thorolf, Egil's brother, and he do not get along either. So Thorolf is planning to go off to Norway, and Egil wants to go with him, but Thorolf refuses to take him. So what does Egil do? He goes and he sinks Thorolf's ship, and tells him that he's going to keep doing things like that until Thorolf agrees to take him. And so Thorolf grudgingly agrees to take Egil with him to Norway, and at one point the narrator says that their relationship, Thorolf's and Egil's relationship, is rather strained, which might be an understatement. But anyway, given the way that Egil has behaved in this first chunk that we've seen him in, it's easy to see kind of where the conflict will come from in the rest of the saga, and I'm quite excited to read about it. I think it should be quite fascinating. And then one last thing that starts to come up in this part of the saga is the poetry. We start to see the poetry that this saga is known for, both from Egil and from other people. And it seems to be pretty common in this saga, and it's come up in other sagas as well, where someone will just speak some verses out, right? Like, as you do, of course. And that's the thing that people just, I guess that's the thing that people do in Icelandic saga. They just speak verses when the time is appropriate. And we start to see that here. And I can't say as I'm super impressed by the poetry itself as poetry yet. It is in translation, which always brings a lot of, a lot of bias in, right? Like, it's really difficult to translate poetry well, but we really start to see the poetry in this section. And I'm interested to see more of it, because I know that there are one or two very long poems in this saga. So, anyway. So those are my thoughts on this second chunk of Egil's saga. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the saga if you are reading along. But other than that, I will let you all go.